Dmitry Stelletsky's commission to execute the murals and icons for the parish church of the Saint-Serge Theological Institute in Paris. I'll explore how his design struck a balance between religious and aesthetic concerns. On the one hand, Stelletsky's deep knowledge of medieval Russian churches and icon painting, as well as Orthodox ritual, underpinned many of his designs and resonated with the Russian community abroad. But just first to kind of set this in context of the canonical art of the Russian Orthodox Church. Until the late 17th century, artistic production in Russia was largely dedicated to the service of the church. The visual arts were dominated by the Byzantine tradition of icon painting, which was brought over from Constantinople. And you see a few examples here. One of the most famous icons on the left, the Trinity icon. And in the middle, you have this screen of icons called the iconostasis, which is part of the very important part of the space and what all of the worship in the Orthodox Church is directed at in the church. And on the right, I want to flag up this monastery and its fresco painting, the Ferapontiv Monastery and the Church of the Nativity in the turn of the 16th century, because this we'll be hearing about a lot today. And so there's a very specific holy canon of how to do this art and how to do these churches. And it's very sacrilegious within the Orthodox Church to depart from this canon. And for those of you who are less familiar with icon painting, it's a sacred painted image. And in the Orthodox tradition, it's painted with egg tempera on wood panel. It's of a holy figure, of a saint or Christ, but it's more than just an object. So it's not just in service of the church or to remind you of God or a story. It's meant to be a mediator between you and the divine, between the physical and the spiritual world. So it's a holy object that brings you closer to the divine. So artists in the late 19th and early 20th century began to engage with Orthodox artistic traditions. However, within this period of modernism, the church's official canon was largely ignored, and just kind of giving you some examples here on the screen. This gave rise to subjective and imaginative renderings of church design that were anathema to these strict codes of representation. In opposition to these trends, however, in modernism, appears the figure of Dmitry Stelletsky. Between 1925 and 1927, he executed the mural paintings and iconostasis for the parish church of the Saint-Serge Theological Institute in Paris. So today I'm going to outline his designs at Saint-Serge, and the article that I've published very much sort of talks about his artistic context and how he transformed a 19th century Gothic building into a functioning Orthodox church through his innovative use of space and his use of different medieval sources, and coupled with this very playful style he has in these designs, making it a bold example of what's called the Neo-Russian style, which is similar to Art Nouveau in architecture. But today I want to kind of depart from that a bit and show how he used his deep spiritual knowledge to create designs that were relevant specifically to the Russian émigré community. And so moving to a religious and spiritual rather than aesthetic context. His interior indeed resonated with a crucial concern of many Russians in emigration, the preservation of Russian culture as it had existed before the Russian Revolution. Stelletsky created a kind of sanctuary for émigrés in his designs, incorporating symbols of exile and visual references to medieval Russian churches. Many Russians abroad hailed his achievement, which signaled the revival of a proper school of icon painting outside of Russia and fostered a profound spiritual rejuvenation among Russian émigrés. And it's sort of interesting walking around the park yesterday and getting this tour, wonderful tour by Karun. And it connected me back to Stelletsky a bit, because we need to think more about space and the kind of context of space and our bodily phenomenological experience of spaces and buildings, and how artists very deliberately shape how we operate in these spaces. And I think you can definitely see this today with Stelletsky. But first, a bit of background on the Russian emigration. So after the revolution and civil war in 1917 and the early 1920s, you get this sheer mass of Russians moving abroad, so up to 2 million people at current estimates. And this seemed to usher in the 20th century as, in the words of Edward Said, the age of the refugee. Despite the trauma of this displacement, the now stateless Russians continued their cultural activities outside of Russia, establishing a relatively unified émigré community. Countries as distant as Brazil and Australia, and I'm sure Canada, though I haven't really looked into the links of Russian émigrés there, received Russians. And it was interesting to hear more about Jeffrey's history, because he is someone who he was the son of a Belarusian Jewish émigré in the early 20th century. So he's kind of part of this history of Russian emigration as well. And so these sort of themes resonate with Jeffrey's life and work as well. But most Russians chose nearby Europe with Paris as an important center of their cultural life. And what's important to remember throughout all of this in the 1920s and 1930s is the majority of émigrés did not view their time abroad as permanent. They were hoping instead that political circumstances would change in the Soviet Union and they could go home. So upholding traditions was therefore critical, so that when émigrés did return to their native land, this culture could be easily restored. And amongst these activities, the Russian Orthodox Church reformed in Europe, with Paris as a very important center. Saint-Serge became one of the most important Orthodox churches outside of the Soviet Union. After the Russian Revolution in 1918, the anti-religious Bolshevik government took away the church's property rights, right of legal entity, and ability to educate its clerics. And two leading bodies emerged abroad to kind of counter this. And one of them was in Serbia, and the other was in Paris, so right where our church is. And many émigrés, the intellectual elite in particular, took a new interest in the Orthodox Church abroad, as that it provided a means to keep Russian cultural traditions alive and a source of spiritual renewal in the face of exile. The existing Orthodox Church in Paris, the Alexander Nevsky, could not accommodate this huge influx of Russian émigrés coming in the 20s, and the need for a new building arose. In addition, the Bolsheviks' ban on religious education meant that an Orthodox theological institute was desperately needed, and one large enough to house students from around the world. So this is kind of the context of how Saint-Serge came about. And so all of these scholars and lay leaders came together to search for a site where to put this church, and all of this money was trickling in from donors ranging from taxi drivers to someone who became later the president of the YMCA. So everyone's kind of pooling their money towards this church. And in 1924, a former German church came up for auction in Paris. The auction took place on the holy day of Saint Sergius of Radonège, and the head of the church in Paris passed an icon of Saint Sergius to the person who was bidding for the church. And after some competition with the Salvation Army during the auction, they won the church. And Saint-Serge was a real hotbed for radical Russian Orthodox thought. And I'm not really going to get into this, but it's fascinating. Because having moved abroad, the Orthodox Church became part of a broader Christian dialogue for the very first time in its history. Theologians from Saint-Serge interacted with members of Western Christian faiths. The church's relationship with the general Russian populace before the revolution, it also dramatically changed at Saint-Serge. So before the revolution, the church had not, with some exceptions, been seen to respond to the social, educational, political, and intellectual issues of big concern to Russians in the early 20th century. And in contrast, emigration, sort of outreach, became a real priority. So a free medical service was launched at Saint-Serge on the site. So things like that, sort of initiatives like that. And so the church became this kind of dynamic, charitable, intellectual force. And I find this endlessly fascinating, could go on about it forever, but I need to get to Stelletsky. But I kind of want to drive home the gravity of what this particular church and building meant to this community living in exile. The church building was in desperate need of repair and required both the funds to make it usable and an artist to turn the interior of this 19th century Gothic building into that of a functioning Orthodox church. There was a committee to address this. Stelletsky's name was put forward. Very heated debate about this. People were very against him. They wanted an artist with a more kind of realist approach, more conventional. Stelletsky was very devout, but he was a fine artist and a bit of a wild card. And there's a brilliant story about how he won this commission, which I can go to in greater detail if you want later on. So Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, who's a member of the imperial family, she offered to sell a valuable emerald worth 50,000 francs. And this is a kind of story in itself with this emerald, but on the condition that, quote, no one else but Stelletsky design it. And so it's this romantic tale of why he was chosen, this sort of classic white Russian emigre tale. But it shows that these battles, who will design this church, they were hard won. They were taken extremely seriously. And Stelletsky really rose to this challenge. And here you get just an example of one of his secular paintings on the left. His interest in decorating Saint-Serge was both artistic and personal. Working such a large-scale project for the church would have appealed to his deep Orthodox faith. And he was someone who had a forensic knowledge of medieval Russian art. He traveled all around Russia in the early 1900s. He sketched, gathered information, gathered books. He knew this art inside and out, and he took the Canon extremely seriously. He wrote in 1928, one of the medieval Russian system's main responsibilities was, as we know, the precise observation of the Canon, which demanded its painters stringent observation of the, and this is underlined, established style. In practice, however, for Stelletsky, and by the way, he never commented on these designs, so I'm kind of piecing together what he may have thought about this. While his icons at Saint-Serge and the iconostasis largely met Orthodox requirements, and visual continuity with medieval church decoration in Russia was a central concern, he nonetheless imposed his subjective artistic approach on the designs, particularly the murals. This experimentation may have been out of necessity, given the church building was not Orthodox, but Gothic. And unlike a Orthodox cross and square plan, as we see on the left at the Church of the Nativity, Saint-Serge follows a standard cruciform plan, which we see on the right. And so it presents Stelletsky with this huge challenge. How do you develop this very specific Orthodox program within this structure? In the Orthodox canon, the uppermost cupolas and apse symbolize heaven. The three holiest figures, Christ, Pantocrator, the Virgin, and the angel, they must reside there. At Saint-Serge, Stelletsky placed the Virgin in the apse as per convention. So here, does this mouse work? On the left, this is what's in the apse. It's behind the iconostasis, so it's basically impossible to photograph. So this is a black and white photograph of it. And so he's putting the Virgin in the apse as per convention. She appears as the Virgin of the Sign, or more specifically, the Great Panagea, as the figure is full length. The Virgin is shown in the Iran's position, with her arms raised up to the heavens in prayer, symbolizing her role as a mediator between God and the people. The composition and manner in which Stelletsky overlapped the halos of the clustered figures of the apostles and prophets are very similar to, and this is our church we have to remember for today, the Pokrov Mother of God at the Church of the Nativity at Fairpontiff by Dionysi and his sons. In the apse at Saint-Serge, however, individual artistic details come through. Stelletsky's approach is far more stylized, especially in the drapery, and unusually this Rublov Trinities, this famous icon, is depicted right above the Virgin's head. The location of the Trinity is not canonical, but it's directly associated with her church's patron, Saint Sergius, who worshipped the cult of the Trinity and founded the Trinity Lavra Monastery in its honor. After the death of Saint Sergius, Andrei Rublov, the icon painter here, painted the Trinity icon in tribute to his teachings. So Stelletsky is perhaps very deliberately using such a well-known and recognizably Russian image to forge a stronger connection between Saint-Serge and the Orthodox Church in Russia. The way he integrated the long barrel-vaulted nave, an element not found in traditional Orthodox churches, jars perhaps the most with traditional Orthodox architecture and reflects the kind of theatricality of the Neo-Russian style. In each of the three vaults, he paints 4 seraphim. I'm saying that with a Russian accent for some reason. Literally meaning burning ones. They're angels who circle the throne of God, and they're ordinarily found in icon painting. They do appear in wall painting, but the centrality given to them is very unusual. So in the Church of the Nativity, on the walls of the nave, they appear. But they kind of complement scenes rather than take up all this much space. But, to kind of use the logic here, the ceiling of the nave constitutes one of the highest holy zones of the church at Saint-Serge, where angels may be painted. And seraphim are the holiest beings in the angelic hierarchy. In the iconography of the Virgin of the Sign, when the Virgin raises her hands to the heavens, seraphim or cherubim often circle above. This iconography may have influenced Stelletsky's Mural Scheme, as the seraphim lead across the ceiling of the nave to the apse. So if you kind of imagine this barrel-vaulted nave with all of these seraphim leading down, and the Virgin has her hands up like this. So this would certainly account for the unusual and extensive use of the angels in such a holy area of the church. They also form this pattern which leads to the central crossing, where the 4 evangelists you see on the right are painted in their animal forms. They're often part of the dome in the Orthodox Canon, and Stelletsky places them in front of the iconostasis where a dome would be. And such decisions resourcefully bend the rules, reflecting both a highly original use of space and a logical and knowledgeable use of the canon. I'm not going to dwell on his very playful designs. Sorry about that for those of you who are keen on these, but this is in the article. But just to kind of show you the images of them and the kind of sources he was looking at for them, they're really incredible. I mean, this church, I had no idea what it looked like when I went. There are no photographs really online, and the color in this absolutely blew me away. In other areas of the church, however, Stelletsky adhered more closely to Orthodox conventions. References to notable medieval churches are more evident, underlining the continuity between ancient Orthodox traditions and Saint-Serge. One church appears to have been a major source of inspiration for Stelletsky, the church of, guess what, the Nativity at Ferepontiv Monastery in the Vologda region, which we've been looking at a lot. It was one of the most important sites of Orthodox church art for its extensive and well-preserved fresco scheme by Dionisi. Oh yeah, here we go. Ferepontiv was very well known to Stelletsky. He visited it in 1907, he sketched it, and he created the frontispiece for a 1911 book, which published photographs of it. And so he really knew this church well. These hanging cloth motifs, which you see on the left, which run across the lower part of all of the walls of Saint-Serge, around the entire space, they're perhaps the most deferential to earlier precedents. And they're seen in a lot of Russian churches and palaces at the Kremlin, but they very much, of course, resemble those at Ferepontiv. Both Stelletsky and Dionisi's medallions are made up of stylized plant motifs shaded with earthy hues. Each vary in shape and color, but some of them are nearly identical, and Stelletsky certainly borrowed these from the interior. And they form this lovely path from the facade into the church along the nave, kind of leading the parishioners to the iconostasis. So they also play a role in that sense. And they create the importance of the general fresco scheme and create this strong link with the Church of the Nativity. And so this expression of these motifs found at the Church of the Nativity is not coincidental. By relating Saint-Serge to such an important religious site, Stelletsky created a powerful association between the Russian émigré community and Russia's religious past. Such an explicit reference to this church connected Saint-Serge directly to one of the most significant monasteries of the Orthodox Church, making the church in Paris heir to the long-standing traditions, rituals, and art of the church in Russia. By surrounding parishioners with visual signifiers of Russia's ancient religious past, Stelletsky enveloped them within a familiar world, giving purpose and stability to their spiritual lives in emigration. In turn, he associated his own work with the masterful Dionisi, perhaps in an attempt to quash any doubts about his capability to decorate Saint-Serge. The correlation between émigré Russia and celebrated periods of ecclesiastical art in Russia was not lost on émigrés in France at the time as well. Neither were the symbolic allusions to the Russian emigration, which appear throughout the murals and iconostasis of Saint-Serge. The wall paintings in the narthex openly refer to the theme of exile. So these are terrible slides. I was so busy photographing all the beautiful foliage and kind of more modernist designs and didn't really pay attention to these. The wall paintings in the narthex, which is where it's located, so right as you walk in, that's the space, and you're surrounded by these. They openly refer to the theme of exile. Several inscriptions, which you see on the bottom, in Church Slavonic, appear on the walls of Saint-Serge. And it's not known whether Stelletsky chose these inscriptions himself, but I think he did. And one of these inscriptions quotes the first 5 verses from Psalm 137, which reads, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forgive thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning." As a song of remembrance, a call to remember Jerusalem in the face of spiritual and physical exile, Psalm 137 clearly had particular significance for the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. And indeed, the articles on the church at the time very specifically refer to this inscription. The psalm also symbolizes Stelletsky's task at Saint-Serge. His most important commission, both as an artist and a member of the Orthodox Church, must be carried out far from his Russian homeland. He must, quote, sing the Lord's song in a strange land. The 3 scenes painted in the narthex reiterate this theme of exile. Noah's Ark, terrible slide, but you can see the water there on the right, provides a refuge for Christians and offers salvation for the faithful. Moses and the burning bush, which we see on the left, recalls Moses' task from God to lead his people out of Egypt to the Promised Land. The 3 men in the fiery furnace would have resonated as well with the Russians in emigration, who sought to preserve their faith and culture in a foreign land. 3 Jews in the book of Daniel who refused to be assimilated into Babylonian culture and worship false idols during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II were thrown into the furnace by their captors, only to be protected by God. Through these images in the passage from Psalm 137, Stelletsky turned the narthex into a space for émigrés to reflect upon their separation from Russia and provide solace through the tales of exile in the Bible. Entering the church through the narthex thus becomes an act of remembrance, helping the parishioner transition from the strange land of the outside world into the holy space of the church's interior by acknowledging the physical and spiritual displacement from the Russian land and church. This idea also plays out, we come to my favorite part of today, the mural scheme, in the mural scheme. And this is perhaps, and I didn't get this in my article, and I really wanted to, but it didn't quite fit. It's perhaps the most original example of Stelletsky's approach to church design. And it's the execution of one of the most difficult tasks that he faced at Saint-Serge, the integration of the Gothic-style lancet windows and the rose window on the walls on the ends of the north and south transepts. So if you kind of think about, if you're looking down the nave, the iconostasis is at the end. This is when you get down to that point of that crossing, to the left and to the right. And here's a close-up of that. Very hard to photograph, so this is the best I could do. To rectify these windows, Stelletsky painted a brightly colored architectural cityscape over the entire wall on both sides, and he boldly places the rose window in the middle of the central five-domed Orthodox church. This architecture is reminiscent of icon painting around the turn of the 16th century, which Stelletsky would have known from his travels and of course collections of icons that he knew very well. However, there is a specific composition found in several 16th century icons that he may have been drawing upon, which appears in the Rejoiceth icon of the Mother of God from the late 15th to early 16th century. So here on the left, the Virgin is enthroned at the center of a large 5-domed church surrounded by vegetation, echoing Stelletsky's placement of the window. The icon originally was part of, guess where it was, the iconostasis of the Church of the Nativity in Fair-Pontof. As can be seen in a photograph from the early 20th century we see here on the right. So it is down here. So it's not in situ anymore. So Stelletsky would have seen the icon in its original location, as we see it here, further emphasizing the link between Saint-Serge and the Church of the Nativity. This connection demonstrates Stelletsky's visual knowledge of icon painting and willingness to use various elements of medieval painting at Saint-Serge, which are outside the canon of church decoration, but still relate to Orthodox iconography. And this was a guess I had and conjecture, and I had one of those wonderful art history moments where you find out that you're right. There were some sketchbooks of Stelletsky's that came up at auction at Christie's in London, and there we go. So he is thinking about this, and this is the church here, and where the rose window would be, and the Virgin. And so it shows this, it suggests that this particular icon was one that he was definitely thinking about. Rather than just a clever integration of architectural elements into the mural, Stelletsky's choice to portray Russian cityscapes on these walls may have had wider implications. Let's go back to it while we talk about it. In a sense, he transformed the foreign space into a Russian one by painting an overtly Russian view with domed cathedrals in an area dominated by a Gothic-style rose window, a signifier, if you will, for the Western Church. This kind of Russification of space symbolizes the lives of Russians in emigration. They are forced to occupy a foreign land, but attempted to turn it into a place they could recognize and call home. The alien and new became familiar and habitual, as the old Russia lived on through the process of remembrance and recreation. The Russia that Stelletsky's colorful cities embodied was an idealized vision of the past, but propagated hope for the future. Throughout the mural scheme, the process of preserving and remembering played a central role, whether it was the propagation of the neo-Russian style, significant historical Russian Orthodox churches, or more literal reminders of exile, such as biblical passages. At the same time, this continuity was wedded with innovation, creating art that was intrinsically Russian, yet daring and original. The symbolism and overall importance of Stelletsky's work at Saint-Serge did not go unnoticed by émigrés at the time. It was written about in the press. In 1927, one critic wrote, for example, "By the brush of the artist Stelletsky, the interior of an old German church is turned into a miracle of Orthodox icon painting. The church is painted in the style of the 16th century." He continued that Saint-Serge was, quote, "not only a place for prayer, but a monument to the Russian, medieval Russian creative vision, created in our own absolutely non-medieval Russian time." And it served as this kind of beacon of Russian culture in the foreign space émigrés now occupied. And one critic, Sergei Makovsky, who was very supportive of Stelletsky's work, he wrote a lot on him throughout Stelletsky's career. And in 1957, he wrote in a Paris Russian newspaper that he saw Stelletsky's designs at Saint-Serge as, quote, "the most significant of all that future Russia will inherit from emigration. It is as if he's sprinkled aqua vitae on our church painting. Can it be doubted that icon painting lies in Russia's future?" He elaborated on this, and this is where he's kind of taking this a lot wider than what it means for Russian Orthodoxy and Russian religious art. He writes, "Art should be crowned with religious consciousness, a desire for higher reality from the truth of the material world. The decline of European art is from the loss of this consciousness. In this lies its downfall, but future Russia will return higher meaning to art. This is what Stelletsky believed." For Makovsky at Saint-Serge, Stelletsky contributed more than anyone in emigration towards the preservation of artistic culture and spirituality that was crucial for Russia's future. Beyond the émigré community, Stelletsky's work had the potential to rejuvenate the spiritual power of art lost in the West. It's also remarkable to note that Makovsky is writing here of future Russia in 1956, and that's very late. It's something you would think of people talking about in the 20s. So even then, Makovsky saw that culture needed to be preserved for future generations. There's still that kind of hope there. And so Stelletsky's design were valued for their artistic impact, but also for their deep spiritual value and his revival of the medieval Russian style. The visual and religious link to the past undoubtedly resonated with Russians in emigration, who sought a connection to the land they'd lost. In this sense, his interior at Saint-Serge struck a chord with the persistent hope that, despite the continual existence of the Soviet Union, the past would be restored. And I want to end on a visit I had a few weeks ago to the St. John the Baptist Monastery, which was founded by a theologian in Essex in the 1950s. And the founder was a graduate of the Saint-Serge Institute, and he knew Stelletsky in the 1920s. And in the library, which you see here, 2 little Stelletsky icon sketches. And they're a little bit rubbish, so I didn't zoom in on them. They're very sketchy. I was like, are these by him? But they are. But they're in the library today, so in the monastery. So if you're studying there, you look up and you see Stelletsky. And I wanted to draw your attention to the refectory on the left, and on the right, their main chapel, and these seraphim that we saw before in the ceiling, and how before Stelletsky this was unprecedented to have them all along the ceiling. So you get them in the refectory and in the chapel. And I just was so struck by how Stelletsky's ideas continued and spread in emigration. And they underlined that not just the aesthetic, but the serious kind of sacred legacy that he left on Russian religious art. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki, for that wonderful paper. Fascinating to compare it to the 2 papers beforehand, because it's a similar period, similar relationship between art and religious or spiritual thinking, and yet couldn't be more different. And I think it reminds us that modernism is not the only story of 20th century art as well, which is an important thing to remember. Do any students have any questions? We've got 20 minutes before lunch, so let's get started with questions. Do any students want to start? Yes, you, and then David.
So thank you for that presentation. We've been talking a lot about different ways of seeing today, as well as language, and I couldn't help but notice that when talking about observation, the importance of observation of the canon, there's also in the word observation, the visual aspect of observing, but as well religious observance. And I'm wondering if that's just an English translation coincidence, or if in Russian the word observation was intentional for the double meaning.
Thank you, Emma, for that question. That's fascinating to think about the ways of seeing, and if, observing, we kind of observe with our eyes, but also kind of spiritual observation of faith. And I think what's fascinating about the Orthodox tradition is that link is so strong, because these are not just objects to tell you a story and to remind you of God. They are God, and they are holy. And so that seeing and believing is incredibly bound up within this tradition. And I think that's something that Stelletsky really captures and gets, particularly as someone who is a creative fine artist and uses his imagination, but is also super religious. I mean, he lived a sort of ascetic life. At Saint-Serge, he slept in the gallery in the chapel. So he took this so seriously. But yeah, I think that I can't think of a kind of linguistic connection between the two, but it's fascinating to think about observing faith and observing the world and that connection there. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to sort of build on Emma's question a little bit. In the chapter for reading, early on, you discuss some of the concern surrounding Stelletsky's imitative aesthetic rather than authentic aesthetic. And in terms of observing something like orthodoxy, you've I think described very well some of the artistic license he took in painting his imitative form into a space that was not entirely receptive, and successfully. But again, I'm interested in the reception. You did mention how some of his images would have resonated with émigrés in particular. How was his imitative Orthodox artistic form received by the community that peopled that church?
I'm so glad you asked that, and this is actually a big part that I cut out, because I was like, is this too boring? But should have thrown it back in. Where at the time, and this is something I've really had to unpick about Stelletsky, at the time, everyone pretty much talked about how his work was a copy of a 16th century Orthodox church. And you all have seen Ferapontiv today. It is not a copy at all. And we've seen all of his innovations. But I think there was it was very much in the spirit of that time, and it was interpreted so seriously that he really, Makovsky, that critic I mentioned, talked about how he saw the world with the eyes of an ancient man. And so he's very much coming from this sort of monastic, medieval perspective. And it was seen as so authentic that people talked about it as a copy. And so I've had to kind of unpack this literature and say, well, no, it's not a copy. These people were wrong about that. And there are a lot of nuances in, for example, how his icon painting was received amongst icon painters in Paris. Some of them were furious because they didn't think he even used egg tempera, which doesn't sound scandalous, but it is. And so I think that imitation point is really important with Stelletsky, to be kind of nuanced in how we approach it, because people at the time weren't as nuanced. But I think they just kind of wanted it to be a copy too. They wanted it to be in this spirit, and they saw that as so important. And because he's someone whose work is so, it's so much more kind of forensic and dedicated and expert compared to his contemporaries, it was seen as more of a copy. So I hope that kind of answers the full extent of your question.
Is there any social history about, the congregants, and how did they respond to?
Well, the literature I've seen is mostly from critics, and one person whose quotes I cut because I didn't have time, Liev Zander, was a layman, but he was someone who was very much part of that community, and he unpacked every single element of this church and was obsessed with it. And so that was not just something that he personally understood, but he wanted the Orthodox community to know how important Stelletsky's designs were, and kind of how clever they were. And the head, the Metropolitan of Western Europe, who became head of the church in Paris after the revolution, he was not happy about Stelletsky being chosen. He came around, at least publicly, and said, yes, these designs, they really do kind of meet our expectations, and they echo the spirit of medieval Russia. And are great for our parishioners. But yeah, I am kind of missing the accounts, and this is something if I went and did more kind of oral history at Saint-Serge itself, to hear how just everyday people and worshippers would have reacted to that space, which would be fascinating to find out. Yes, Brian.
Brian and then Alan.
Thank you. Nikki, I'm interested in what was the process, the structure within which he had to work for decision-making? I mean, typically in decorating any church, certainly in the Western tradition, the artist wouldn't have a free hand. So the question here is presumably he had some form of oversight, advisory, interpretation. Could you say a bit about that and how you think that affected the overall work?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. Because as you see, this was like a battleground that you wouldn't have thought of, that people really fought for these very specific things, and how he wouldn't, we're seeing these designs and thinking he had total free reign, but as you say, he would have been checked by the committee. He would have been checked by, religious leaders he really respected as a devout believer. There's a great, I don't think I have it here, but there's a great quote by Makovsky where he describes how angry and frustrated Stelletsky was, and how these church leaders, they just fought, and it was this push and pull back and forth, where they wanted, they didn't like the designs, they were trying to rein him in, and Stelletsky did have to compromise on many of them. And there's this great story about how the people that and there was one who Stelletsky really fought with, and actually, after the designs were done, he knelt before him. This was one of the priests, and asked his forgiveness because the fight was so bad. But that guy led this team of people, and it's sort of comedy. They erected a rival cross in the space when it was done. They're like, no, this is what we want in contrast to this. And Stelletsky was like, nope, and then took it down. And so it's this, and it's silly and it's fun, but it's also Stelletsky, he was so devout, but he was also an artist. And he was someone who really had something to express here that was also beyond the canon. So there was a lot of fighting, and compromise.
In a wider sense, is this also symptomatic of the emigre community and the kind of battles and the sense of authority that had totally changed?
I think, the emigre community, bless them, they were constantly like, we are a united front, and we are a united community, and we have these beliefs. But there was a lot of infighting. And you can imagine a community so all of the Russians who were involved with the provisional government in 1917, after the February Revolution, they moved abroad. So it's all these different politicians too, and they all have rival newspapers and rival beliefs. And so it's a very, I make them out to be all these rosy emigres who believe the same things. But there was a lot of fighting. But I guess they were fighting for a common goal. And that's what's key here. And they were united in that sense. I think that answers your question.
I wanted to ask you something completely different, I guess. I was thinking of the League of the Godless in the Soviet Union and the heavy satire directed towards Russian Orthodoxy and all the inversions that are going on in terms of mocking the ceremonies, et cetera, et cetera. And are you aware of a critical reception of this church and any kind of satirical play in the Soviet Union, as holding up this ultra-Orthodox example of Russian emigre culture as reactionary, a sign of decadence, etc.?
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, because we always have to think of what's going on in the Soviet Union, and I can't think of any specific examples of Saint-Serge being satirized, but of course, vehement anti-religion in not just kind of caricatures, but in children's literature and in schools. And there's this whole visual culture disseminated, damning the church. And I can't think of specifically their mocking of emigres, because I think they wouldn't have wanted to emphasize, these traditions are going on over there. That's kind of my sense. But there was definitely a kind of warring, what the Soviet Union was doing visually, the emigres were combating and they were countering. And they very much were aware of Soviet newspapers, what was going on in the Soviet Union with letters, and you can see a lot of the visual things, Russian emigres later in the late 20s and early 30s, visually appropriating some of what the Soviets were doing within their own visual language in emigration. And so there is this back and forth. But I can't find it specifically in relation to religion, but the emigres, they were being really vehement about religion and religious education in contrast to what was going on.
That's fascinating. So you're saying that the emigres started appropriating some of the imagery and
that's what I'm
languages?
finding. Not a huge extent of it yet, but you also get emigres coming later, like Georgy Annenkov, who is a Russian avant-garde artist, and he came and he was a brilliant satirical cartoonist in Emigration, and he did all these, in 1931, all these caricatures. And he's someone who had he'd been in the Soviet Union in the 20s and was experiencing the kind of revolution in visual culture that was going on there. And he was coming back and using that, but from an émigré perspective. And because we think of Russian émigrés as having a dated visual language, and what I'm finding is that it's increasingly not true. So yeah, there's a back and forth between not just kind of a dialogue within culture, but visual culture.
I have a question from Masha and then Amanda.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I have a question kind of following up from Alan, but taking it to now. And particularly kind of interested in legacy of Russian emigration and its relationship to contemporary Russia. And we all have seen the rise of Russian Orthodox Church and its position in relation to power and politics in Putin's Russia. So I'm interested whether this particular church and in general the visual kind of culture of Russian immigration is being written about, but also kind of reappropriated as sites of national heritage by the Russian church. Because, and I haven't been myself, but there is a new Russian church that was built in kind of very contemporary design, and all I've heard about it myself is quite critical things, but I don't know whether you can say anything about that, because I think that certainly there is a great interest in kind of Paris as a site of Russian Orthodox Church and what it means to power and politics now.
Thank you very much for that. So the contemporary church is not something I'm that well versed in. But to my knowledge, these émigré churches are still kind of outside the purview of that revival that's going on in Russia. And I do know that, so I think Katya Dianina is working on icons, that paper she gave in Venice. These sort of horrible icons. I mean, there's no way about it. They are awful. And she this like amazing academic was giving this paper, and I kind of wanted to raise my hand and be like, these are awful. Can you address that? You know, there's a taste issue here. And there's also the sense that outside of Russia, icon painting continued at places like St. John the Baptist and was sort of passed down. And then there are these other icon painting traditions that really distort that legacy that was carried on emigration. And I think I asked at the nuns at the monastery as well, the relationship between the church in Russia now and these various churches. And she said that it really depends church by church, whether they're back under the umbrella of the Orthodox Church or whether they're outside of it. But I've yet to look into the kind of continuities within icon painting and fresco painting and what is going on now. So that'd be fascinating to explore. You know, will Stelletsky get a revival in Putin's Russia? Who knows?
Amanda?
Thank you, Nikki, so much for your presentation. I really have had no exposure to Russian Orthodox churches, so it really was a treat, so thank you. But today we talked on light and color and the relationship with the divine and the sacred, but specifically in Stelletsky's case, like as we saw in his particular placement of the window within the cityscape, how did he view light and space as part of his work in the Orthodox Church? You know, did it have the same iconographic properties as his paintings?
That's a great question. And as you can see from my terrible photograph, light is something to take into account in this space because you can't see a lot of these designs properly. And that's important to take into account kind of if you're a worshiper as well. Stelletsky, I'm not quite sure. I mean, within the Orthodox icon tradition, color was very important. So holy colors such as red, there's a kind of symbolic connection there. Stelletsky, I'm not quite sure what his thoughts were on that because his thoughts on anything pretty much don't survive. But in the iconostasis, which I didn't get to talk about because it's a whole other layer to this, I always am struck by the reds and the greens and how they form this pattern. And so I'm not sure about the holiness of that. But for Stelletsky, it's a very aesthetic. He wants the iconostasis to look like a whole object in itself. And he uses the colors to kind of connect that and beautifully perhaps bring together all of these icons that tell various stories about various saints together. So that's something kind of more to look into. Thank you for that.
Can I ask you a question? One of the things that struck me as very different between the artists that Lika and Lucy were talking about and Dmitry Stelletsky was they were working with this relentlessly reinventing form, and he was working with a tradition and an established style. And I just wanted to ask, that established style you mentioned, when was it established? Who was it established by? What was it established by?
Within the Orthodox Church?
Within the Orthodox Church. I mean, how far back can we find that style?
So it was, this is slightly out of my area, but it was established, so icon painting was established in Byzantium, which was then transferred over to and adopted in Russia. And, we can kind of view this symbolically by, many of you are probably familiar with the Vladimir Mother of God icon, which is in the Tretyakov Gallery, which is such an incredible image. And it was actually an icon Stelletsky knew really well, and there were a lot of discoveries about it at the time. And one of these discoveries was that it is not a Russian icon, but it comes from Byzantium. And so this was a tradition that was very much brought over, but with it, with the sort of 12th century in Russia, they developed their own interpretation of that. And to our knowledge about, Stelletsky actually writes about this, where he says, we don't really know what people of those times actually thought and how they approached these things. And particularly at that time, icon painters were not artists, and these were not artworks. This was a holy tradition. But you still develop innovation within that. And there are various schools of icon painting that became very famous in the early medieval period, such as Novgorod, that had their own visual traditions. And then you get these awful 18th century icons, I think. I'm doing a lot of kind of connoisseurial judgment today. The 18th century icons became very westernized. And in the 19th century, they looked very realist, and they were appropriating Western forms in a way that was unprecedented. And so Stelletsky is someone who's like, oh no, none of that. We're looking at the older tradition. But yeah, I wish we knew more about the development and how that happened.
Can I just
Yes.
add something? I'm also interested, Nikki, I wonder if you can say anything, because it was precisely at this time when the church and religion is obviously banned by the Soviets, but where icons become a subject of research and study, and this is where a lot of conservation and writing and research, kind of more serious research is being done on it. And I wonder whether there is any kind of dialogue there at all.
Dialogue between...
In terms of kind of going back to the kind of traditions set by particular schools and not deviating from it.
Yeah, I think...
From Stelletsky's own choice to do that.
Well, Stelletsky, he was very up to date on Soviet. So, for those of you who don't know, in the 20s, this is kind of what you wouldn't have thought would have happened. They organized all these sort of scientific, as they called them, expeditions of curators to go to remote monasteries and kind of rescue these icons that had been sort of so blacked over with soot and kind of incense, and bring them back into the cities and have them cleaned and restored. And that discovery of the Vladimir Mother of God icon I mentioned, and museums, and taking these things out of churches, because they're like, the churches are messing up with the care of these icons, the restoration of these icons. We need, the church, bad church, we need to take them back in and look at these things as objects and as artistic objects out of a religious context. And that Vladimir Mother of God discovery was made in the Soviet period. And it was published about, and Stelletsky read the publication and he knew about it. And so people were reading about that. And so there's this new generation of Soviet scholars who are doing this cutting edge research that made people like Nicodim Kondakov look like dinosaurs. And so Stelletsky, I think, is more of that older generation. But yeah, it's important to remember that these icon painting at this time is being reassessed in Russia, but very much from an artistic perspective. This is our legacy, and it has been clouded by the church, and they have mishandled these objects. And now, to go back to Masha's other question, these objects are going back into churches. And there's a huge fight over this that's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nikki, very much. And thank you, well, let's have a round of applause just for Nikki. And thank you to all three speakers this morning. There have been three